A key focus elsewhere. Reuters reported this week that after a small handful of cases were detected in Wuhan, China, officials there said they'd be testing all 11 million residents. Wuhan is, of course, where evidence shows the virus outbreak began. And despite apparent efforts from China to downplay the virus, they couldn't hide the entirety of their reaction. And that is what caught the attention of one senator now leading the charge against China.
I could tell early on in January that China's rhetoric, that they were in control and the virus was not a threat and there's no cause for alarm, contrasted with their draconian, extreme measures to counteract the virus.
Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton.
It's like canceling schools nationwide or literally welding the doors shut on apartment buildings. So that's what set off the alarms to me early on. But for as long as I've been in public life, I've recognized China as a grave threat to the United States, with an ultimate ambition to replace us as the world's preeminent economic and military power. So some of the measures I've proposed, like trying to keep Huawei, the Chinese telecom giant that is effectively an arm of Chinese intelligence, out of Western telecom systems, are longstanding. Now, I've introduced new measures related to this virus, for instance, trying to bring back pharmaceutical manufacturing to the United States, and other measures that are designed more broadly to check Chinese emissions in the Western Pacific and around the world. And that's because China is the most serious long-term threat the country faces to our security and prosperity.
When we talk about bringing pharmaceutical manufacturing back, how delicate a process is that? And do we run the risk of China saying, oh, you're going to go ahead and do that? Well, we're just going to stop making the medications you need right now.
So China is already threatening those kinds of actions against many nations, threatening to withhold either drugs or needed protective equipment from nations if, for instance, they don't agree to use Huawei in their fifth-generation wireless build-out. Or just refusing to send protective equipment to a country unless the head of state goes and meets the Chinese airplane and kowtows on the tarmac for the cameras. So we have to be mindful that in the short term, the world is somewhat dependent, not entirely, but somewhat dependent on China for both drugs and medical equipment. But that's why in the medium and especially the long term, we can never allow China to continue to have such a stranglehold on so many critical supplies to keep our people safe, healthy, and prosperous.
Where are you, though, on our own mistakes? It seems like we did make quite a few here, China or not, whether that was, not maybe having enough equipment on our own stockpile, to our own testing delays and failures, including, unbelievably, our own tests, some of which were tainted with the actual virus.
Yeah, so first off, I would commend the president for taking an action that was considered very controversial at the time of stopping air travel from China in late January. I'd advocated for that since the middle of January when I first started contrasting Chinese rhetoric to action. That bought us several weeks of needed time. And it did the same thing with Europe as well. Again, it wasn't foolproof. It wasn't ever going to stop the virus from reaching the United States, but it certainly bought time. You're right that probably the worst mistake the federal bureaucracy has made is when the Centers for Disease Control insisted on doing its own tests, manufacturing its own tests from scratch, rather than, if you will, letting a thousand flowers bloom in some of our great laboratories and companies all around the world. The FDA as well, allowed the CDC to do that, and then was slow on certifying other possible tests in early February. So that's regrettable. In the end, though, the challenge that we have had is not so much a science challenge about developing the right kind of tests. It's really a production challenge of being able to develop testing equipment for a nation of 330 million people, as opposed to, say, Austria with a nation of 8 million people, or Taiwan, an island nation of 22 million people. But over time, we have begun to meet that challenge. That's why now, on a per capita basis, we have one of the best records in the country for testing. But it would have been better early on, of course.
Of course. I mean, look at how many people have died. Look at how many people have died since then. I mean, do you think testing could have made a big difference?
So I think the lessons that we've seen from countries around the world is that testing can help slow the spread of the virus and therefore help protect the capacity of our hospital systems, which again is the reason why we instituted such severe measures in March related to social distancing. But in the end, the virus is so highly contagious in so many different settings, testing can only do so much. It's better to have more testing than less testing, especially testing at sites that are most vulnerable, like nursing home sites or critical infrastructure that can only engage in a limited amount of social distancing given the necessities of work, like meatpacking plants. So testing is very important in those places. But in the end, even the nations that have had the best approach to testing, especially in Europe, you still see pretty significant numbers of cases and deaths on a per capita basis. And sadly, that's just a reflection of the very highly contagious and very deadly nature of the virus for some populations.
States are starting to reopen, as you know, some allowing more than others. This is apparently changing the models, I guess, yet again. University of Washington's Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation is now estimating that about 137,000 people could die from COVID. And I think a lot of us don't really know what to say anymore about these models changing, right? Like if you're for reopening because you care about livelihoods and jobs, then you're accused of being okay with letting people die. And then you hear, far more people may die because we're increasing mobility. And it's just, it's like everybody's between a rock and a hard place. Like, what do we do here?
Well, I've never been a big fan of any of the models. Not to say that models can't be useful for decision making, but they're always based to a degree on speculation as opposed to hard information. So I prefer to look at the hard data. We have a lot of data now that we didn't have 2 months ago, not just from the United States and places like New York that were particularly hard hit, but also from Europe. And you see countries that were hit with the virus a few weeks before we were, they're now been a few weeks ahead of us in terms of getting their economy back on its feet. And so far, seems to be working for them in places like Austria and Denmark and Germany as well. So I think we should learn as much as we can from those international models and also examples, not models, I should say. And then also, kind of gradually move forward with getting our economy back on its feet, getting people back to work, getting them back in their normal routines. Obviously, if there's a big surge in cases somewhere, that might cause us to recalibrate or pull back on the reins a little bit. But it's vitally important that we get people back to work, back into their normal routines, because the government cannot replace the economy. And without a healthy, strong, functioning economy, people are at risk not just of their livelihoods, but also their health as well. They're foregoing basic treatments like mammograms or colon screenings.
Yeah.
They are, in many cases, suffering from mental health challenges or stress related to family and the workplace and so forth. So the health and the economic questions are more interconnected than much of the media commentary would suggest. And we have to keep both those things in mind.
Senator, when we talk about reopening and we look at a model country like South Korea, they're experiencing an increase in cases. And we kind of thought they had mastered this, right? But now they're starting to see some more. With contract tracing, now they're trying to notify over 1,500 people after one infected person visited a number of bars and nightclubs in one evening. I think this speaks, one, to the importance of contract tracing, I guess, and knowing who's infected, and two, how one person can do just so much damage and upend the work that you do when you try and isolate for a while.
Yeah, and obviously South Korea has been one of the leading examples in the world, along with Taiwan, for keeping the virus under control. So I'm troubled by the resurgence in cases there over the last couple of days. I certainly hope that they get it under control again. You see the same thing happen in Singapore in April. They had been a world leader as well in March, and then they had a large flare up in April that I think is continuing. It's just a reminder that no matter how much testing there is, how much contact tracing, the virus is so contagious, and there's still so much we don't know about it.
Finally, Senator, on stimulus, there's still a lot of talk that even more is needed as we work slowly towards getting back to normal. I know some Democrats want to give a lot more money to people. Congress has already allocated almost $3 trillion. The president's talking about a payroll tax cut. Our governor in California says 4.5 million people are unemployed, and we had a budget surplus that is now a massive deficit. Where are you on stimulus and how much more we're going to give, and whether or not we could give any to states and counties?
Well, so the Congress has already approved about $3 trillion of spending to help survive the peak of this crisis. A lot of that money, though, hasn't gone out the door. It hasn't hit the pockets of individual workers in the case of enhanced unemployment benefits, which are approved at the end of July, or money to aid state and local governments or to help our hospital systems. So I think for the time being, there's enough money still in the pipeline for us to see how that works, and that hopefully, within a matter of weeks, not months, we will begin to see people getting back to something more like their normal work and consumption routines, and that it won't be necessary to have trillions of dollars of more spending to replace the productive economic activities of our citizens. In the end, I think most people don't want a relief check, they want a paycheck. And that's where I hope we can get very soon, a matter of weeks, not in a matter of months.
Senator Cotton, thank you so much for your time.
Yep, thank you.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network, download